In this video, we're going to be looking at how wages are determined in various markets with a couple of little case studies. So how are wages determined in the free market? Well, in just the same way as any other price is determined by the interactions of supply and demand. The only difference is we need wage and W on the y-axis, quantity of labour, on the x-axis, and sometimes you might even want to put in a D equals MRP if you really want to show off to the examiner on the demand curve. The pay of heavy goods vehicles drivers was rising quite rapidly during that time. So there's some clips there where we're looking at 40% pay rises. Lorry drivers paying 56,000 a year in Wales, 80,000 a year in Staffordshire. So is this a short-term or a long-term thing? Well, we've just seen figures of 56 to 80,000 pounds for HGV jobs, but another website is suggesting that actually the pay is 32,500. So possibly we're looking at a short-term hike in wages of HGV drivers. So let's take a look at elasticities of supply of drivers. Well, you can see how some people can move into HGV driving. So there's an article where someone had been a teacher for 20 years and they ditched it because they could earn £20,000 more driving lorries. And it takes about 3 to 4 months of training to get a license, and also willingness to get that license. There's a bit of evidence here as to the time implications of getting new drivers. So something like 30% of HGV driver vacancies were taking more than 8 weeks to actually be filled. So the elasticity of supply of drivers of HGV vehicles is relatively low. Not many people are going to want to turn from being teachers into HGV drivers or other professions, and it takes something like 2 to 3 months to actually hit that status. The elasticity of demand is also low. If we want those goods delivered to our houses, or shops want those goods delivered to their shops, or petrol stations want the petrol delivered to their forecourts, then they need it to be delivered by lorry. There's no other way of doing it. So we are looking at an inelastic supply curve and a very inelastic demand curve. If we look at some of the reasons for the shortage, more than half of haulier firms suggest that it's drivers retiring as being one of the causes. And you can see down the bottom there that the average age of an HGV driver is 55. So there's a lot of people leaving the market. What about Brexit? Well, again, more than half of firms suggested that that was a factor. Now, there is a lorry driver shortage across all of the EU. But the thing is, because there's a single labour market in the EU and freedom of movement of labour, if you've got big problems, then that can to a certain extent be ironed out by drivers moving between countries. Since Britain left the EU, we can't have that within the UK. About half of firms reported that there were problems with recent changes to off-payment working rules known as IR35. So again, that's a factor. Drivers leaving the industry to go to another industry, again reported by almost half firms. Pay rates, now remember, that is something that is in the control of the haulier firms. Again, that's cited by just under half. COVID, because there's going to be a lot of drivers self-isolating, just shy of 40%. So we've got the main reasons causing this shortage, and you'll notice all of those are supply reasons. So we are not looking at a massive increase in demand. So how do we show that on a diagram? Well, there's people leaving the industry, there's a lack of supply from Europe. So we are looking at a leftward shift of the supply curve. And if you have an inelastic demand curve, you can see there you don't need much of a shift in the supply curve to cause a big increase in the short-term wage rate. So what's the government tried to do about it? Well, one of the things that they've done is they've tried to move away from their very strict labour rules following Brexit. So they've granted 5,000 emergency visas for foreign lorry drivers, which will run from around about September to up to Christmas. You'll notice that there are shortages in other areas as well. There's about 5,500 poultry staff lost. But again, same thing. We're looking at basically a 3-month visa. Elasticity, how successful has that been? Well, by October, the beginning of October, only 27 tanker drivers had actually applied for these. And when Boris Johnson gave his speech at the Conservative Party conference, only 127 lorry drivers had applied for these. Now, if you think about it, we're looking at very short-term visas, and presumably a lot of these drivers will have permanent jobs within the EU. So that could help to explain it. Secondly, they've tried to get the army to learn how to drive, particularly petrol tankers. And of course, the other thing, and this is quite strange for a free market supporting government, they've blamed the hauliers themselves because what Boris Johnson has said is that conditions were too poor for lorry drivers and claimed employers were responsible for the low uptake of emergency visas. Well, so much for lorry drivers. I want to look at pay differentials between different jobs and do a mini case study. Well, obviously as a teacher, I'm going to be interested in the pay of teachers. So on average, teachers in red are paid about $33,000 a year. Train drivers in green are paid nearly 50% more than that a year. You'll notice that train drivers are only 15,000 below economists, and economists is a very highly paid profession. Now, the free market corrective mechanism for these differences are that the high pay of train drivers will attract people to move out of teaching into train driving. And of course, that isn't the case because we're looking at pretty long-term differentials here. Now, whenever we look at a change in pay or a change in prices for that matter, there are really 4 things that we should be looking for as economists. Factors affecting supply, factors affecting demand, distortions in the market, and whether the government has taken any particular actions in that market. So we're going to be applying these to the teacher market. Remember, teachers are red, and the lorry drivers market, lorry drivers are green. Let's go through some supply factors. Well, in order to become a teacher, you need to train for 3 to 4 years. It's a graduate profession. For a train driver, you need GCSEs, and it's 1 to 2 years. So that would suggest that the teaching profession has a higher restriction on labour. Well, some of the disadvantages of the job. Well, in the case of teaching, the main disadvantage are workload and stress. You can see there that teachers work an average of 47 hours a week, and about 1 in 4 of them work more than 60 hours a week, and 1 in 10 more than 65. Now, the negative side of train driving is you get lots of shift work and potential incidents. In teaching, there's potentially stress, particularly if you've got disengaged students. So again, that would tend to suggest that that will restrict the supply of people into teaching, suggesting that maybe teachers in a free market would be paid more. What about the non-salary benefits? Well, one big benefit of teaching is the fact that you get regular holidays. You're no more than about 8 weeks away from your next break, and those holidays tend to be long. Even half terms are 1 week in the public sector, and sometimes it's 2 weeks in the private sector. For railway workers, well, they get either free rail travel or cheap rail travel. So there's, again, benefits on both sides there. But overall on supply, it would tend to suggest that teachers would be paying more because supply is going to be more restricted. What about the demand factors? Well, both jobs are vital. If you want a thriving economy in the long term, you need an educated workforce. Similarly, in the short run, if you've got to transport people and goods from place to place, so both of them are required. Remember that the demand curve for labour is the marginal revenue product curve. So to what extent can we measure the productivity in both of the professions? Well, for teaching, possibly you could look at pass rates, class sizes, grades, that sort of thing. It's easier to measure productivity of train drivers, perhaps in terms of miles travelled or passenger miles travelled. But remember, the demand curve isn't productivity, it's revenue productivity. So to what extent can we turn that productivity into money? And can that be measured? Well, in the case of teaching, no. In the case of train drivers, possibly not. You could potentially use fares to convert those passenger miles into revenue productivity, into actual money. So to what extent could distortions in the market be responsible for this difference? Well, there are two potential distortions: monopsonistic power and monopolistic power. Now, monopsonistic power is exercised by powerful employers using their collective buying power to basically drive down wages in a sector. And in teaching, 88% of teachers work for the state, so the state has a staggeringly high amount of monopsonistic power. In the case of the rail industry, there's substantially less monopsonistic power. There are a range of rail firms that a driver could choose to be employed with if they don't like their current employer. There's a couple of sort of caveats to that. First of all, some rail firms do dominate particular regions, so if you're a rail driver in one of those regions, you haven't really got anyone else to go to. And if we look at this over time, there's been a decrease in the number of firms in that industry. Slowly they're being bought back, possibly into the public sector. So that will mean that the monopsonistic power of employers will be slowly rising. But generally speaking, there's a lot more monopsony power in teaching to drive down wages than there is in the rail industry. To counter monopsony power to drive down wages, we need to look at the extent to which employees band together in unions and use their monopoly selling power to drive up wages. Well, teaching is fairly heavily unionised, and what's more, that unionisation is concentrated in two hands. The National Education Union, the NEU, have more than half of the total union membership, and the NASUWT has more than a quarter. Recent changes have increased that monopolistic power, because in 2017 the National Union of Teachers and the Association of Teachers and Lecturers merged together, so that gave the NEU more monopoly power. The train driving industry is even more heavily unionised at about 20,000 train drivers. Most of them are in ASLEF and a smaller number are in the RMT. So for that power to be effective, you've got to have the willingness to use it. And in the case of teaching, teachers have not been that willing to use their industrial power. Have a look at some of those headlines. So we've got something in 2008, which was the largest strike for more than 20 years. Then we've got another one 5 years later in 2013, again another one-day strike. So you're looking at lots and lots and lots of little one-day strikes. There tend to be lots of threats of strikes, but those strikes aren't actually carried out. So they use the threat of a strike as a bargaining tool. And the other thing that they do is they tend to take a soft approach. And if you think about it, teachers work directly with students. So there's a lot of human interactions. And so you're likely to feel more guilty if you take industrial action. And what's more, if say, you're going to go on strike at a time when it would be effective, say during exam time, well, if you're actually supervising an exam, you're instructed by your union not to strike on that particular day. So you've got a relatively soft approach. You tend to get strike action taken at not particularly important times of the school year. You'll notice there we've got one in July. Well, what happens in July apart from watching the odd video? I know perhaps it's a bit more than that, and one in October, which is well away from the exams. Now, in the case of rail drivers, you haven't got that closer connection with the people that you're working with. So they are much more willing to take strike action, lots of threats of strike action and lots of actual action, particularly at crucial times when people need to travel, like Easter, Christmas or the summer holidays. So much more willing to use that monopoly power. So again, there's a clear difference between those two industries. So teachers tend to take one-day strikes at not particularly effective times, whereas the train drivers are much more willing to take longer strikes and at times when it could be really crucial for the firms. Now, a teacher strike would have a long-term impact on the economy if that strike was going to be sustained. However, the success of a teacher strike will largely be dependent upon maintaining the goodwill, particularly of parents, so they can put pressure on the government to get the teachers back to work. And the weird thing about a teacher strike is that it will actually save money for their employers. So if teachers strike, they're not paid. Now, there's no revenue implications on the local authorities whatsoever. So the local authorities will save money every single day the teachers go on strike. In the case of train drivers, there is an immediate impact on the economy because people can't get to work, they can't go on holiday, they can't travel around the country. And there is an immediate impact on the profits of their employers. Okay, they don't have to pay the workers, but they get more in revenue than they pay out in costs. That's how firms make profits. And so there's going to be an immediate impact on the profit of the train operating companies, the TOCs. So in the case of rail drivers, they're more willing to take action. They take action for a longer period of time at crucial times, and it has a much more immediate impact than teachers' action. So the final factor that we need to look at is government actions. Well, we've said that in the case of teaching, the government has an awful lot of monopsony power. 88% of teachers work for the government. They're also quite willing to use that power in the way that teaching unions aren't that willing to use their monopoly power. The government is quite prepared to use its monopsony power. So between 2010 and 2012, teachers had their pay frozen. Between 2012 and 2017, for 5 years, the rises were capped at 1% below inflation. And in July 2021, once again, teachers' pay was frozen. In the case of train drivers, there are no government actions. The government does not have control over that at all. So hopefully, if you look particularly at the demand factors, the revenue product things linked to the distortions of the market with the willingness of rail unions to use their industrial power and the willingness of the government to use its monopsony power over teachers, hopefully we've managed to explain why train drivers get nearly 50% more in their salaries than teachers. Thank you.